walking down the street, passing up business cards, as I want to do, and I ran across a lady that was dressed in a 19th century garb, including a bonnet and a wool shawl, going out to get her nail. I thought, you know what, I got to do this lady. That's how I came to know Patti House and husband Scott, and as you recall, Scott made their presentation a couple of years ago, very interesting. They let me know I learned to do work from the houses, and I think I've told you before, but for being sesquicentennial, I quickly ascertained my great knowledge of Latin probably had something to do with the 100th anniversary of the first sighting of Bigfoot. I'm guessing that probably would be what?
Why are you asking me about Bigfoot?
At any rate, it's the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, as you might know. And Patti is a member of the Cape Girardeau Historical Preservation Commission. And she has some interesting things to say today. So let's give them all a welcome.
Well, thank you, and happy 4th of July to everybody. I'll give you a little background. I did not grow up in Cape Girardeau. I grew up in the Carolinas. I was a teacher for 31 years. Never did I think I'd be standing here 25 years later after meeting my husband Scott in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of some things that I've learned about Cape Girardeau. First of all, it's a city to be proud of. As one of the Civil War soldiers, it was said it was a marble city. And we're so fortunate to have so many historic sites here to promote heritage tourism. You'll see here one of our interpretive signs that we have at Fort D. And I heard someone say, Civil War, there was nothing civil about it, and that's certainly true. If you see the title, it was unwanted, untrained, and indispensable. And I'm talking about the ladies that served during the Civil War. When the Civil War started, the place of the lady was in the home. She really didn't reach out to anybody but family members. There were no really trained nurses except for the Catholic sisters. And many of the surgeons did not want women. And if you know anything about Dorothea Dix, she wanted only unattractive women because there was a fear of romantic couplings or whatever during the Civil War. So the nurses were the walking wounded. They could hardly take care of themselves, let alone the ones that were wounded. Not only was it difficult for the women to become a part of the Civil War, but at the beginning, it was also hard for some of the surgeons to become a part. And there were only 3 or 4 positions available in the different units. One of these men was Thomas Hawley. Thomas Hawley was from Illinois, and he was a doctor, and he wanted to become a part. He tried several different units in Illinois. When they filled up, then he could not be a part, and therefore he finally became a part of a Missouri regiment, the 11th Missouri, and he came to Cape Girardeau as a doctor. And he writes on September 29th about the home that they've taken. We know this house today as the Minton House, but he wrote, as you see, the hospital was changed from the old mill and the 2-story small farmhouse to a private residence. So you see, we live at home. Nice office, chairs, large looking glass, office and front parlor, 7 rooms upstairs for the sick. Thomas Hawley wrote over 200 letters during the Civil War back home, and we get a lot of information from him. He was also in Cape Girardeau in 1864, and he's the one that wrote back about this marbled city and how he would really like to live here. He did eventually settle in St. Louis and practice medicine there until his death. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I'm going to get you a mental map here so you can, oops. Here's Cape Girardeau, Mound City, Cairo, Paducah, and then all the way up here is Savannah, Tennessee, and Shiloh. So kind of keep those locations in mind. Mountain City, if you visited there recently, there's not much to see there except the National Cemetery. But in 1861, it was quite a booming city. It had a large naval yard, it had a foundry, and it also had a hospital. In October of 1861, the governor of Indiana requested the Catholic sisters to please come help in the hospitals. And so there were 6 of these ladies that answered the call, one of those being Sister Magdalene, who was Ellen Kiernan when she immigrated from Ireland. Along with her came her niece, who was from New York and was married to a George Gill. Her name was Julia Kiernan Gill. And they arrived in Paducah and then eventually went to Mound City, where the warehouses were being turned into hospitals. Again, the women played a huge part in realizing that the soldiers were not going to get well unless the hospitals or the buildings they were using were cleaned up. And so these sisters went to work cleaning up the warehouse to become a hospital. And there you see the Mound City Hospital, an old warehouse turned into one. And it was the biggest on the western front at this time. Sister Magdalene stayed there all during the Civil War until the hospital closed. And then she went on to become a nurse in Cairo, where she died in 1908. Her niece, Julia Gill, left in 1863, went back to New York, and there we know that she had her first child in 1864, and her name was Ellen. By 1876, Julia and her husband George were living here in Cape Girardeau. In 1892, women were finally allowed to apply for a pension, and so Julia applied for a pension, $12 a month, because she said that she had a disease of the right side and nervousness. So she was granted this pension. And here's her pension paper at her death. And she received this $12 until she died. Julia is buried at Lorimer Cemetery. Her daughter, Ellen, requested her military headstone. To my knowledge, she's the only woman that I know buried at Lorimer that has a military headstone. Daughter Ellen was a nurse at Old St. Francis Hospital here in town, and granddaughter Ellen also became a nurse. Julia Gill died in 1918 of a stroke, and her funeral took place from a house on Lorimer Street that still stands today. 1862, this huge armada goes down the Mississippi, and they're going to try to capture island number 10, which is in a strategic location. One of the boats there is the Red Rover. The Red Rover was built in 1859 in Cape Girardeau, and it was bought by the Confederacy for a transport ship. They were going to use it kind of as a floating barracks. Instead of hoping that they would block the route, they scuttled the Red Rover, and it was about right here is the Red Rover. So they scuttled this during the attack, and the Union Army took possession of the Red Rover. And here's what, that was a side wheeler. Here's what it looked like. The Army took possession. Now, they turned it into a hospital, a floating hospital boat. It was not the first hospital boat. There were several going up and down the Mississippi at this time. However, in December of 1862, this boat became the first United States naval hospital ship, built here in Cape Girardeau, called the Red Rover. It transported hundreds of sick and dying and wounded soldiers back to the hospital in Mound City. And here's a picture of what it might have looked like with one of the Catholic sisters on board. We know that it docked at Mound City, but Sister Magdalene and Julia Gill are not on the roster anywhere. But most likely, when that boat docked at Mound City, they were there ministering to the sick and dying. Cape Girardeau, ideal location on the Mississippi River. In 1861, there were 4 forts built in Cape. There was, Fort A, Fort B, Fort C, and Fort D. In the fall of 1861, John Wesley Powell was put in charge of building these 4 forts. And while here, he met General Grant, and they became friends. In 1861, he asked permission to go to Detroit, Michigan, to marry his half-cousin, Emma Dean. And so he left here, got married, got back on the train, and on November 28th, he and his new bride were on their way back to Cape Girardeau. So Emma Dean began her life here in Cape with her husband, John Wesley Powell. Remember the map that I showed you? Here's the map. Emma Dean, here's a picture of Emma Dean. Emma Dean ships out with her husband, John Wesley Powell. John Wesley Powell, again, they did not have permission to roster in Missouri soldiers, so they had a group of Cape Girardeau men that had an artillery unit. So in the spring of 1862, they ship out from Fort D, and they go to Savannah. Emma Dean is dropped off at Grant's headquarters at Savannah, and John Wesley Powell and his men from Cape Girardeau go on to Shiloh, get off at Pittsburgh Landing. The next couple of weeks, armed drilling. And on the morning of April 6, 1862, the Battle of Shiloh begins. John Wesley Powell and his crew are unassigned at the time, but they eventually make their way to a spot, if you've been to Shiloh, known as the Hornet's Nest. And John Wesley Powell is raising his hand to show that the cannon is getting ready to be fired, and a ball hits his wrist, and he has to leave the battle at that point. He's put on a transport ship and taken back to Savannah, where his wife, Emma Dean, is waiting for him. She nurses him through those terrible hours of that evening, and 2 days later, his arm is amputated. After the war, John Wesley Powell is the one that's given credit for leading the first expedition down the Colorado River and naming the Grand Canyon. In our journeys to try to find out more about John Wesley Powell and his wife, we go to Green River, Wyoming, where John Wesley Powell put his ships in. And here's the museum there. And we have to go to Page, Arizona, where they ended up. And there's a replica of one of the boats there, and he named it the Emma Dean after his wife. So we have to visit there with our John Wesley Powell's Fort D shirts on, and our dogs, Wes and Emma. The museum curator was just intrigued with the story and promises one day he'll visit here in Cape Girardeau. John Wesley Powell and his wife, Emma Dean, are buried at Arlington Cemetery. In 1866, Frank Moore writes a book, and he says, "But it is possible for the devoted wife, without sacrificing the delicacy of her sex, to be for the great part of the time within short distance of her husband in active duty. When the forces are in garrison, she can be with him constantly, and when he is wounded, she be near enough to dress his wounds. And when he falls, she may secure for him a careful and Christian burial." A lot of the officers' wives did travel with the soldiers, and this is true of Belle Reynolds. Belle Reynolds was also a newlywed when the Civil War began, and her husband joined the 17th Illinois, and they were one of the first troops to be here in Cape Girardeau, and she was with him. She writes, "The winter of 1861 was passed in military reviews and in the gaieties of camp, the 17th Illinois being stationed at Cape Girardeau. The river is open at the time, so if you ever read any of the Argus newspapers, there's a lot of partying going on in Cape Girardeau because the river's open and they're getting the goods that they need." So Belle Reynolds is here in Cape Girardeau until, again, the transport ship start up the Tennessee River toward Shiloh. Belle is in camp, and from her at Shiloh on April 6th, we have one of the most vivid accounts of that battle. She and Mrs. N were camped nearby. They were not in the military camp. They were camping near their husbands. and she was sitting by the fire cooking cakes for her husband, when all of a sudden, they thought it was pickets, but then cannonballs started coming into their camp, and the Confederates were attacking. She stayed by the fire, cooked her husband's cakes. He, of course, had to go to his men. When he rode up on horseback, he said, "Belle, what will happen to you?" Well, Belle was in for it, because at this time, by then, the wounded are trying to make their way back to Pittsburgh Landing. And so she's in the turmoil. She and Mrs. N gathered their baskets. They go to another part of the camp, hoping to be safe there. The quartermaster says, "Ladies, you have to leave now." And sure enough, cannonballs are starting to shred the tents. They make their way back to Pittsburgh Landing, where the transport ships are now trying to take the wounded back to Savannah. For 36 hours, she took care of the wounded. At one point, she was given a revolver and asked to stand on the dock of the boat to guard so that no more men would get on board. They were panicked. They wanted to get out of there. And so that is what she did. At the Shiloh meeting house, that's why the battle is called the Battle of Shiloh. The field hospital was this little meeting house here, and she writes about the gruesomeness of what she had to witness with the wounded coming in. And she says she had nightmares about what she did see. She emptied her purse to buy gingerbread from a sutler. The sutler moved with the soldiers carrying goods. And she bought gingerbread for the wounded. So next time you eat gingerbread, think of Belle Reynolds. You can imagine that these women got worn out. It was more than I can even imagine what they went through. Some of the stories that you read of the field hospitals with the arms and the legs that have been amputated piled up outside the windows. So Belle has to recuperate, and she is on a train with the governor of Illinois, Governor Yates, and she tells her story about the Battle of Shiloh. He is so impressed that he gives her the honorary rank of Major Reynolds. So she is now called Mrs. Major Reynolds. And this is her picture that appeared in the Harper's Weekly. Belle remained with her husband until he mustered out in toward the end of the war, early 1865. She went on to receive her medical degree and went as far as the Philippines with Clara Barton's Red Cross. Of course, we have to travel to Shiloh and find the spot where Belle Reynolds was camped that morning. So here marks the spot of the 17th Illinois. The governor of Wisconsin at this time is Lewis Harvey, and his wife is Cordelia Harvey. She is the president of the Madison Ladies Union Aid Society. At the Battle of Shiloh, the governor hears that there are 4 Wisconsin regiments that have been badly wounded. And so he gathers supplies, and he goes to Shiloh to take these supplies to the wounded. When he's getting back on board one of the ships to go back home, he slips and falls, and he drowns in the river. His wife, of course, is devastated. And she decides that she wants to remain to the task. And so the then governor, Solomon of Wisconsin, assigns her to be a sanitary agent. And so she travels up and down the Mississippi River looking after the Wisconsin soldiers. She wears a black cloak, whether it be because she's in mourning or because she wants the soldiers to be able to recognize her very easily is uncertain. But she writes, "In the fall of 1862, I found myself in Cape Girardeau, where hospitals were being improvised for the immediate use of the sick and dying then being brought in from swamps by the returning regiments, and up the rivers in closely crowded hospital boats. These hospitals were mere sheds filled with cots as thick as they could stand, with scarcely room for one person to pass between them. Pneumonia, typhoid, and camp fevers, and that fearful scourge of the southern swamps and rivers, chronic diarrhea, occupied every bed." We know that she stayed at the St. Charles Hotel, which was located at the corner of Main and Themis. If you know where Pastime Antiques is, that's where that was located. Because in her notes, there's a receipt from the St. Charles Hotel. saying that she had stayed 4 days and was charged $4. She also requested supplies be sent to Cape Girardeau. Sometimes the handwriting is very hard to read, so I transcribed one of these so you can kind of get an idea of some of the supplies that she requested. One thing that I learned recently, if you see the 24 cans fruit, and under that the 2 jars dough, well, DO means ditto, and I did not know that at the time, so she's requesting 2 jars of fruit as well. From a letter that she wrote, this again dated from Cape Girardeau, she says, "The sick men cry like children. Some of them are only boys and say, 'Oh, my mother, can't I go home, Mrs. Harvey?' Some try to look brave, but the lip quivers. One strong, large-framed man said to me, 'Your husband is gone. I wish we were all with him.'" Now, from Cordelia's perspective, Cape Girardeau is the South, because she's from Wisconsin, which is the North. And so she feels like that these Wisconsin soldiers need to get out of the South and be shipped north. And so, again, she needs recuperation time. She goes to Washington, D.C. and requests an audience with Abraham Lincoln. Well, Abraham Lincoln, for one thing, didn't really want to be told by a woman what to do, but listened to her plea to try to get these soldiers north so that they could recuperate. He was afraid they would desert. Her reply was, "They can't fight if they're dead." So she had about 5 audiences with Abraham Lincoln, and he finally relented and agreed that yes, some soldiers' homes needed to be opened for these men to recuperate. So the first one was opened in Madison, Wisconsin. It was called the Harvey Hospital. After the war, you can imagine, there were many, many orphans, and this home was turned into an orphan's home, and Cordelia worked with them as well. She did go on to remarry, but she is buried by her husband in Wisconsin. And there's a wayside near Kenosha, Wisconsin, that tells about Cordelia. Cordelia Harvey was also in Ironton, Missouri, and the 150th of the Battle of Pilot Knob is coming up last weekend in September, and I just transcribed a letter from her that she wrote in Ironton about the Wisconsin soldiers as well. So we're back to the sign at Fort D. The ladies were unwanted, they were untrained, but there were anywhere between 8,000 and 20,000 women that served as Civil War nurses. They went on to become nurses and doctors themselves. I could tell you many stories about many different women. This is just a few of the women that I found information about that were here in Cape Girardeau. I am on the Historic Preservation Commission, but I'm also the event planner for Fort D. I'd like to invite you to celebrate your 4th of July with us tomorrow. We will be there from 9 to 3. We have a dedicated group of volunteers here in town that represent the Civil War. Fort D is the only of the forts that remain. It is in its original location, and you get a good idea of what it would have been like to be camped inside the walls. We have one more event, Labor Day. Memorial Day weekend, we had over 1,000 visitors, and there were 45 reenactors. So the word is out. We're happy. We're pleased that the city supports us. I've left some brochures over here. It is a city park, so we are part of the Cape Girardeau Parks Development Foundation, which is a 501c3. There is information if you care to donate. That's how we put on our programs, is from our donations. All of us are volunteers. And I've left a Civil War driving tour of Cape Girardeau that tells about some of these other sites. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
So what's going on tomorrow?
Tomorrow we have a cannon, which is a 3-inch ordnance rifle. So they'll fire the cannon. The guys will fire their rifles. We have a little solar area that we sell some t-shirts and things like that. It's mainly a good opportunity to talk to some of the volunteers and to hear a lot of different stories about the Civil War.
What happened to the St. Charles Hotel?
To my knowledge, it was torn down. Is that right, Mr. Ford? This report?
You were there, weren't
Yes.
you? In your last slide, you had a picture of people standing in front of a stone building. Was that an original building?
Actually, we call it the Block House. It was built in the 1930s. It was a WPA project, built to look like a fort, and it was supposed to be a museum. It was used by Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts. There's a shuffleboard fort down there that was used by senior citizens. Then it just all got boarded up. And in 2005, our local Civil War Roundtable took an interest. The boards were all taken off. Parks put up the rails for us so it could be protected. Built a nice shed inside. It does not have a roof, so we're kind of at the mercy of the weather when we're down there. But like I say, we do have a